We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
With the Durham findings becoming a political football and each side keen to either bolster or destroy the investigation before it's even done, what's most missing is the legal analysis of what has been found to date. So what crimes have actually been committed? What are the ramifications of such? And will there ever actually be a trial? To find out these answers, we're once again talking Liberty with the host of the excellent Uprising podcast and Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire. Thanks for being back on the show, Scott.
Always a pleasure, Mark. Cheers.
Okay, Scott, I guess the first question has to be, what are the allegations or suggestions made by John Durham's recent filings, and are they indicative of actual crimes?
To the second question, I will say that they lend themselves to the crime of lying to the FBI chiefly, and perhaps other crimes depending on who had legal access to the data in question. So as I understand it, and it is a little convoluted, is that a computer company had access to certain data. They had legal access to that data because they were servicing their customers, and that's how they got access to the data, DNS or domain name server data. And then they used their access to that data to provide it or help Hillary Clinton's campaign, in any case, craft a narrative by sort of selling it. And I don't mean that in a literal sense, but I mean offering it to federal agencies, namely the FBI and the CIA, to then hopefully get them to instigate an investigation about what that data suggested. I hope that was
okay, now, were they within their rights to offer that data? Because presumably they were employed to do work for the clients. Now, here we're talking, there was the Trump campaign, and of course, there's also talk of it being the White House Executive Office, which is the President Trump's information. Now, surely...
Well, let's just stop the tape right there and talk about that second part about whether or not this concerned behavior or data that was gathered while Mr. Trump was president of the United States. The very latest court filings suggest that that is not the case, that all of the discussion about the data and the data provided was about candidate Trump and not President Trump. That's according to the latest filings made in response to the Durham filing.
So were those who were providing DNS services legally allowed to sell that data onwards or to provide that data to third parties, as far as we know?
Okay, well, that's where things get interesting. So presumably a contract with one party would have confidentiality provisions included in it, but it would have to be the party that they had the contract with that would have to assert it. So if you contract with an entity to provide you internet service and you're a political campaign, it's up to you to assert your privilege over the confidentiality of that information, not just some member of the public. But I will say this, for any company that has data that they believe suggests that there may be, that they may actually have honestly believe that there is some treason or other federal or state crime involved, it's up to them to actually go ahead and say, blow the whistle and say, hey, listen, FBI, whoever, we believe we may see evidence of a crime here. That's appropriate. And that wouldn't violate a confidentiality clause. In fact, you couldn't have a confidentiality clause that included protection from evidence of a crime. So that part isn't about it. But with the Hillary Clinton campaign, it stands to reason that if you have access to this data in one avenue in which it's legal for you to have access to this data, and then you use it for your own means and methods over on the other side of the coin, right? That is likely violative of at least presumably your contract with who you had the data with originally, if not some other federal or state law that governs trade secrets and things like that.
So let me just clarify that then. So the latest findings suggest that people hired by the Clinton campaign hired others or operated with others to craft a narrative based on either illegally or legally obtained electronic info, which then got shopped around to government agencies in the hopes of starting a Russian collusion investigation. Do I have that about right?
I think so, yes. It's a bit tough to keep track of for myself. But so we have this lawyer, Mr. Sussman. He's the one who's been currently charged with a federal crime of lying to the FBI. And what it appears is that he had access through another client of his to this data. And what he did was, and apparently this is uncontroverted as far as I've seen, is he lied about that he was in fact representing a client, that he and perhaps this other person went to the FBI and said, hey, look, we discovered this stuff and here you go, when in fact he was being paid to go to the FBI to say, hey, get the ball rolling on this kind of investigation.
I noticed that when the left-leaning media outlets actually do cover this story on the rare occasions they do so, the writers are attempting to play down what's happening to a certain degree. Now, they may be right to do so, but is it fair to say that the same treatment or leniency wasn't given to the Mueller investigation?
I think it was, if it wasn't Glenn Reynolds at Instapundit, it was somebody who he quotes often, which is to say that the correct way to think about these big box media types is that they're simply Democrat Party operatives with bylines. And so all the coverage is going to skew in one direction when they're writing it. That absolutely is true.
Okay, now it's been over 1,000 days since the investigation began. And is there a deadline in sight? And I think more importantly, is there some kind of statute of limitations issue here?
Just 2 weeks to stop the spread, Mark. That's all. That's all we need, right? Well, there are statute of limitations concerns. I think that, for instance, Mr. Sussman, he cannot be charged with some of the newer allegations, I believe, because there's a 5-year, it seems, statute of limitations for instance, lying to the FBI. There may be other crimes that can be uncovered where that statute may not apply, and knowledge of the crime, if a crime goes undiscovered and then it's discovered, that's when the statute starts, basically, right? So there are complications that could exist there. I would say that those charges, though, we better start seeing some soon if they're going to be made, I think. On the flip side of that coin, it seems like when the federal government wants to go after somebody, there are enough avenues for them to go after them that I wouldn't want to be on the other side of that coin where my only defense to a crime was the statute of limitations. But there are, God, I'm sorry.
I think it's interesting that a lot of these media outlets that we're talking about, they're very much downplaying that, as you say, it's uncontested, that Mr. Sussman lied to the FBI. And they're saying that this is not a big deal. And yet I remember quite clearly, I'm old enough to remember General Flynn being prosecuted for the same thing and then being dragged through the papers for, well, it's going on for 4 years or so, I believe.
It went on for a very long time until he got his pardon, right? Or a commutation. Yeah.
So this brings us back to the question again. Certain crimes, when committed by one person, when compared to committed by another, it all depends on party alliance, it seems.
Well, not only that, but prosecutorial discretion. This lying to the FBI business, while I think it's abhorrent when it's designed by an officer of the court to sick the FBI on an American to create a narrative, that's one type of lying. But the other type of lying is just, where were you on Tuesday? And you don't want to say where you really were, so you lie and you say you were somewhere else, and that kind of lie gets prosecuted. And those lies, for those of us who treasure free speech, we often say that it should be permissible to lie to the FBI, at least for that kind of thing. It gets a bit tricky when you're an officer of the court and you're trying to lie to sick them on, some innocent third party. But straight lying, and sort of the Martha Stewart example, is the one that really I talk about most often. The idea that should be a federal crime, I think, is, it's not supported by the First Amendment.
Okay. Any final thoughts on this that folks should be considering, Scott?
I would just suggest that no matter where Barack Hussein Obama or Hillary Clinton go, that they be confronted with the question of what did they know and when did they know it regarding Mr. Sussman's claims to the FBI on their behalf against Donald Trump.
Scott DiCosenza, thank you ever so much.
Thanks, Mark.
That's just about it for this edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I want to thank our guests, Tim Donner, Jeff Charles, Graham J. Noble, and Scott DiCosenza for joining us. And of course, my warmest thanks to you, the listeners, for coming along for the ride. A final thought before we close out. The idea of a political party or a media establishment crafting a narrative seems in modern times quite innocuous. We literally see it every day and dismiss it as basic politicking. But it's so much more than that. Narratives are the stories and even history of our culture. When a narrative becomes dominant, we lose the truth, the actual facts from the societal record. Don't accept narrative as just simple spin. It's a theft that robs us, first of the past, and ultimately of the future. And that might be the worst crime of all. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're doing it for real, really real. Liberty Nation.
And Jeff Charles, contributor for
I think
LibertyNation.com.
we're starting to make an impact. Liberty style, fight for freedom.
Daily tracking poll sponsored by Liberty Nation for
Guess what?
Thursday.
We're doing it.
Mentioned by Dan Bongino, Rasmussen, Jordan Peterson, and
I
others.
can do it again if you want me to.
Cited in Mark Levin's American Marxism.
I think we're starting to make a really big impact. Get noticed. We're doing it. Rock on.